So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Green Hydrogen Fueling Just Decarbonization, or Green Extractivism Conference, which is organized by the Research Institute for Sustainability, the Universität Hamburg, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and the NJust Network. Today is day 2. Yesterday, we had 2 sessions where we looked at different aspects, different dimensions of hydrogen justice, and in particular also questions of democracy related to green hydrogen and hydrogen justice. Today, in panel 3, in session 3, which I'm chairing, I'm Rainer Quitzow from the Research Institute for Sustainability, and I lead a research group on the geopolitics of transitions in energy and industry there. I will be chairing a panel entitled Hydrogen for the Decarbonization of Industry, Potentials and Pitfalls of Green Industrial Development. And with that, with the focus on decarbonization of industry, we are no longer focusing only on the upstream, the green hydrogen production side, but actually one of the main end-use sectors, the industrial sector, one of the important drivers for the development of green hydrogen, for this renewed interest in green hydrogen, for decarbonization. And it's also a topic that brings us a little bit away from some of the countries that we were looking at yesterday, where it was about questions of hydrogen export, hydrogen production, but also brings us to some of the countries that are going to be using hydrogen for decarbonization of industry in the US, in Europe. And I'm very happy to have a panel here today with 3 speakers who are going to be covering both the developments in industrialized countries and also in the global south and in South Africa. So we're going to have first Laima Eicke, a research associate at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam, who will be giving a kind of a global introduction to some of the questions that these developments bring with them for questions of just transition and relationships between the global north and the global south. Then the second speaker is going to be Joe Hendrick from the Blue-Green Alliance, who's going to be focusing on developments in the United States of America and issues related to industrial decarbonization there, and some of the just transition issues attached to that. And finally, we're going to have Mahandrea Rooplall from the Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa. And he's also running the Secretariat of the Green Hydrogen Panel in South Africa. So he really focuses on issues of green hydrogen and industrial decarbonization in the South African context. And he will be speaking about developments there. So with that, I would like to start with our first panelist, with Laima Eicke. Like I said, she's a researcher at the Research Institute for Sustainability, and she's also been a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, where she's conducted some of the work she's going to be presenting. And yeah, with that, Laima, I'm very happy to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to join the discussion today. Our panel looks at potential pitfalls and pitfalls of green industrial development, and I'm happy to present you some of the research on the topic. So I would like to start out with outlining some potentials. So I think green hydrogen offers, on the one hand side, the potential for greening industries in hard to abate sectors where a direct electrification is really hard to realize, for example, in the steel and chemical sector. And currently, in many areas of these industrial applications, production is still based on fossil hydrogen because it's still cheaper. But this balance between costs might shift due to rising costs for carbon emissions and the European CBAM regulation, due to subsidies for green hydrogen production, as banks divest from fossil fuels and risk perceptions might shift, and also due to a kind of greater willingness to pay of consumers for green products. And based on these factors, we will see a rising demand for green hydrogen. The demand might increase by up to 700% until 2050. And I think this offers, great, some of the great potentials that hydrogen offers in terms of greening current industrial production. But when we look at the locations where currently green hydrogen-based production in the chemical and steel industries takes place, we see that many of the current industrial production sites actually might need to import hydrogen because they're not able to produce all the hydrogen needed for greening these industrial production processes. For example, also in Germany, where Germany expects only to produce 1/3 of the domestic hydrogen demand and is planning to import about 2/3 of the hydrogen needed for greening these industries. And this opens up a lot of questions about trade routes, trade rules and markets that are still in a developmental phase. And on the other hand, I think the second great potential that I would like to outline here is the potential for green industrialization. In several countries where we have very rich resources, very good potential in terms of high wind speeds and high sun radiation. And this is the reason why many economists actually expect some kind of relocation or at least shift in investment patterns in the industries towards countries with very good renewable energy resources that form the basis for green hydrogen production. And this phenomenon can be described with the renewable pull effect. And economic estimations have shown that due to these shifts in investments and of production patterns, there could actually be a huge cost-saving potentials of about 20% in the steel sector and about 50% in the chemical sector if these industries relocate closer to these favorable renewable energy resources. And we actually conducted a stakeholder survey because we were very much interested in the question, what are the most important factors for investors in the steel and chemical sector in 2050? Is it really renewables? Will we see such a renewable pull phenomenon? Or are there other more important factors that might inhibit these developments? And we also asked ourselves, what do actual decision makers think about relocations in their company and their industry based on the renewable pull effect? And we did a survey among the managers in the 50 largest companies worldwide in the steel and chemical sector. And these managers had actual influence on decision-making processes in their company. And we looked out for most even possible regional representation of people from around the world. And based on this empirical analysis, we actually saw strong support for the renewable pull hypothesis. About 92% of respondents agreed that the decarbonization will change the geographic distribution of steel and chemical industries worldwide. And on the right-hand side, you see a rating that the managers did in terms of selecting the most important factors that drive their future investment decisions. And we see that low-cost renewables is the most important determinant of those investment decisions, very much followed by supportive policies and subsidies, but also geopolitical factors such as tensions and alliances or potential trade barriers. Whereas other factors such as current production sites are actually less important and less central to their considerations. So based on this analysis, we kind of have a feeling that, we will see some kind of shifts in investment patterns, but what does this imply for global value chains and how could that look like? What kind of changes can we expect or could we see? And so we try to map industrial value chains or countries' potential along industrial value chains based on 3 criteria. So one was resource endowment, what we just looked at previously, but we also added 2 other dimensions in this categorization of potentials of countries. So one is industrial production, so looking at where currently steel, ammonia, and methanol, which are very important products for chemical production, are produced. And the third factor that we integrated in the analysis is economic relatedness, which refers to or has been used to assess the probability of a country or region to enter a new economic pursuit and to upgrade in value chains, and also to predict economic growth in a certain sector. And based on these three criteria, we then developed a framework where we clustered countries along these three dimensions. And we stated that countries that actually do have not only the resource potential, but also existing markets in the chemical and steel sector and innovative skills might emerge as frontrunners in green hydrogen industrial value chains. Countries that are resource rich with innovative skills but current market constraints might emerge as upgraders and experience a green industrialization, or have at least the potential for such a process. In turn, countries with that are resource constrained have an industrial basis, but lack the resource basis, for example, such as Germany or other European countries, might be green hydrogen importers. And the fourth group are green hydrogen exporters. Those are resource-rich nations without an industrial basis or upgrading potential. And the last group that we named bystanders, that was our resource-constrained nations without markets or innovative skills that won't necessarily play a central role in green hydrogen industrial value chains. And based on this heuristic, we then develop different maps for the chemical sector and the steel sector, and I won't go into this analysis in much detail right now. I would just like to show you one map of how this could tentatively look like. In this map, you see the cross-sectoral potential. So countries are only marked as frontrunners in this map if they have this role in the chemical and the steel sector. And there are very few countries that really are able to integrate these various value chain segments and have a leading role across sectors. So we identified Canada, the US, and China as central players here. But what we see, on the other hand, is that most countries that are currently in the debates as potential green hydrogen exporters that could provide hydrogen for European industries, for example, could actually also engage in further industrial production and further value chain segments in at least one industrial sector and expand their economic activities and potentially gain higher revenues and be less dependent on fluctuations in resource commodity prices as in traditional resource commodity markets, and actually benefit from greater value creation based on industrial production, which also brings higher paid jobs, potentially higher skilled jobs. So that's an actual option to consider for a number of potential green hydrogen exporting countries. Another fact that we identified is that most current production sites of steel, ammonia, and methanol face some kind of resource constraints that partly can be overcome and can be addressed, but it's still another indicator that we might see some shifts in investment patterns over the next decades in these markets. So when we come back to our central questions of potentials and pitfalls for countries in this emerging market, I think one key question is really how will the gains of the emerging green hydrogen economy be distributed? And we see from our analysis that there are opportunities for countries across all world regions, and that a renewable pull effect might actually enable a green industrialization for countries with vast renewable energy resources. But on the other hand, we also see that the promise of sustainable development and green industrialization might depend on further factors and might not be replicable everywhere and might depend on additional mechanisms, for example, on partly technology transfer and financial support. And this might revive previous debates also on these issues in the UNFCCC and beyond. And might also create some new alliances, but also some tensions between the global north and the global south, or also between frontrunners in the that are competing for technology leadership in these industrial value chains. And as these international tensions might materialize, there's a potential for trade barriers and trade conflicts that needs to be addressed. And I think in this regard, agreements on standards in this competition might be important. And this might also include not only standards for green hydrogen and like definitions for these terms and certification schemes, but also standards on the social aspects and sustainability aspects in the process of green hydrogen production. Lastly, I would like to just highlight that we identified some policy recommendations for these different country groups that are tailored towards them. So for front-running countries, it might be super important to support the upscaling of hydrogen applications in the industries early on to achieve scale and cost reductions in this regard. And for upgraders, really partnerships with other countries or any mechanisms that mobilize foreign capital for industrial projects that lower market risks, public-private partnerships in this regard might be important really to enable also technology transfer and learning experiences that might be important for a process of a green industrialization. For green hydrogen importers, it might be important to stimulate innovation in key industrial sectors, to not only look how to compete over the price of industrial products, but also over quality and innovation and technology leadership, to find maybe certain niches in a market, and also to engage in long-term contracts and to reduce market risks, and also to diversify supply of green hydrogen in order to avoid dependencies like we saw as being very problematic in the case of natural gas with Russia. For green hydrogen exporters, it's important to focus on different infrastructure requirements based on the question whether they want to develop into a regional renewable hydrogen supplier or whether they want to focus on global markets. And also in this regard, for infrastructure development, partnerships with importers might be important. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to our discussion and also towards our more in-depth country cases that we will look at in the following presentation. So thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much, Laima. Thank you for setting the scene. We actually have a question here in the chat that I think is sort of very specific to the content of one of your slides, which would be useful to maybe take on. Did you see the question? It was about categorization of, I think, Egypt and another country.
Yes, no problem. So, and this depends just on the criteria that we set out for resources and infrastructure and markets. And you can have an in-detailed look at our categorization in the paper. It's already published in Energy Resources, Energy Research and Social Science. And just shortly, I think in some cases we had like renewable energy potential compared to energy demand. So we subtracted the energy demand from the availability of renewable energy resources, and countries with high energy demand, for example, there the production, the potential of renewable energy is what that would be available for hydrogen production would just be decreased significantly. And another thing that was a constraint, so to say, that we established was freshwater availability. So in some cases like Egypt, I think this was an issue. And as I said, some of these challenges can be overcome. So with a seawater desalination, I think that's something that can in theory be addressed, but might raise additional challenges in terms of potential conflicts around water that we will also delve in the next panel today. And yeah. I'll leave it there shortly. If you're interested in more details, you can have a look at our paper. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for just clarifying that point, and thank you for opening up the space here. I think the point or the takeaway is, this is a kind of a global process of structural change, and there are some potential winners, some potential losers, or different ways and different strategies that countries might want to take to engage here. And that, as you, I think, pointed out, it does offer a lot of opportunities, but it also involves challenges and maybe raises some distributional questions that also have the justice implication. We already spoke about it yesterday when we were talking about the value added that comes with the export of hydrogen. And here we really like bring it down to what we're actually talking about, right? Some of the downstream sectors. So with that, I would like to now turn it over to Joe Kendrick. Like I said, he's an analyst at the Blue-Green Alliance. The Blue-Green Alliance is a very interesting organization that brings together labor unions and environmental organizations to deal with industrial decarbonization issues, with issues of structural change within the United States that come with that. So they're sort of very much at the core of the questions that we're addressing here within the US context. And with that, Joe, I'm very curious to hear about the latest developments in the US.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so my name is Joe Kendrick. I'm a research and policy analyst for manufacturing and industrial transformation at the Blue-Green Alliance. That's an American organization, but I'm actually based in Berlin, so not that far away from many of you. And I'm going to be giving an overview of industrial decarbonization efforts in the US and specifically on the topic of clean hydrogen. So the Blue-Green Alliance, our name has nothing to do with blue or green hydrogen. That refers to the coalition of organizations that we represent, which consists of both labor unions and environmental organizations. This is a very broad and diverse coalition. Our partner organizations do not always agree with each other on everything, but we have good dialogue and good mutual support and derive strength from our coalitional nature. Our general focus and framework is on the belief that the United States economy can and must be decarbonized, and this can and must happen in a way that creates good jobs and good union jobs in particular. We also have a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice goals. That includes things like diverse workforce, pathways into good jobs for traditionally marginalized people and communities, and a focus on just transition for people who stand to be harmed by the transition away from the fossil economy. On the topic specifically of industrial decarbonization, there's broad consensus within our coalition that industrial decarbonization needs to be a major focus of US climate and energy policy. We've successfully advocated for a greater focus on industrial decarbonization in recent US climate legislation. And we're particularly focused on heavy industry with major emissions to produce key materials like steel, cement, aluminum, and concrete. These are materials that have a very high emissions intensity that are critical to the US economy and also to the communities where those materials are manufactured, and that also will be critical in the future for the green transition. So getting their production down to net zero is going to be key. With respect to clean hydrogen in particular, there's general consensus within our coalition that this is a key tool in the toolbox for industrial decarbonization, and in particular, the decarbonization of the steel industry to produce primary steel from direct reduced iron. And we want to see the whole hydrogen supply chain built out in the United States. So we want to produce hydrogen in the US. We want US industry as a major end user of the hydrogen that's produced here. And we even want to do things like manufacture the components for hydrogen electrolysis here in the US. Just because I know this is an international conference, I wanted to make two quick points about the US political system that people might not know. One is that outside organizations in the US have a very large role in setting legislative agendas and crafting legislation and regulations. So BGA is not a formal part of any governing coalition or anything like that, but we do work closely with the presidential administration and the Congress to craft climate and energy policy in a way that's sort of similar to how like a political party might operate in a parliamentary democracy. The other thing is that in the US, it is much easier to pass laws that deal with the tax code and spend money than to pass sort of wholesale regulation. So a lot of major legislation in the US tends to focus on getting money out the door first, and then regulation is accomplished by attaching riders or provisions to the funding that's allocated. So with those two details in mind, some major climate legislation has passed under the current presidential administration. And there are two pieces of legislation in particular that the Blue-Green Alliance has been involved in crafting and advocating for. and that contain industrial decarbonization provisions. The first was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the bill, that was in 2021. It's $550 billion. Most of that is traditional infrastructure funding, roads and bridges and such, but there are also several key provisions for industrial decarbonization and clean hydrogen. And then the second piece of legislation was the Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite the name, contained a huge amount of funding for climate and energy, around $500 billion. Estimates vary as to the total amount that will eventually be allocated. And that as well contains some key industrial decarb and hydrogen-related provisions. Before I talk about the specific industrial decarb and hydrogen provisions, I also want to talk about BGA's focus and the administration's focus on workforce, labor, and equity and justice. So as I said, the administration and the Congress are limited in their ability to just do wholesale economic regulation, but they can attach riders to the funding that's allocated through these bills to try to encourage good jobs, union jobs, and a diverse workforce with pathways into the middle class for people of color and other historically underrepresented communities. Specifically on the point of unionization, the US has fairly weak union and labor laws, and it is not possible for the federal government under the current regime, under the current labor law regime, to simply require unionization, either in the construction workforce that would build out a project or in the manufacturing workforce that might work at a facility that's being decarbonized. But what you can do is you can apply provisions that give unions an advantage, and that then also achieve some of the other goals I just talked about. So these provisions look like some of the things I've listed here, using highly skilled apprentice labor and having on-the-job training, pre-apprenticeship programs to connect people at the high school level into those union apprenticeships, paying a particularly high wage or requiring a particularly high wage to be paid, and then setting up sort of pre-negotiated agreements with labor organizations and other community organizations, which both give labor unions an advantage in bidding on projects and ensure that there will be broad community benefits of the projects that take place. In addition to those sort of rider provisions, both the bill and IRA have geographic considerations in the way funding is allocated, and this is really core in our view for the just transition focus that's a major focus of the Blue-Green Alliance's work. So this is a map. It's actually just a screenshot of an interactive map that lives on our website. The small points show a number of facilities that could potentially receive funding. These are not all industrial facilities, but some of them could receive industrial decarb funding or funding for manufacturing of hydrogen components. And the polygons here show different definitions of communities that the administration, Congress, or the Blue-Green Alliance want to prioritize. So two of these energy communities, which are essentially just transition communities for that used to rely or currently rely on fossil fuels for their economies, and then disadvantaged communities, which are as they sound, those already have legal priority in funding from bill and IRA, and that happens either in the sense that funding for projects in those or facilities in those communities get like a bonus, financial bonus to the amount that they receive, or in the sense that in competitive grant applications, there will be a special consideration given to projects in those communities. We have also advocated to, in addition to those two community definitions, to a third definition to be considered sort of in addition and above those, not prioritized above those, but on top of that consideration, which would be for deindustrialized communities, which would be communities that have suffered significant economic harm from deindustrialization over the past 50 years. And we think that's another important component of the just transition. So now moving on to the actual industrial decarbonization provisions in bill and IRA. It's about $44 billion total, so certainly not the majority of the money, but a significant portion of it. I'm not going to run through all of these one by one, but they sort of range from totally transformative, getting close to net zero or attempting to, down to more incremental stuff that just makes minor improvements step by step. There's funding available for industrial facilities that want to decarbonize their own manufacturing. There's funding available for the producers of hydrogen. There's funding available for companies that are making components that could be used in industrial decarbonization, like electrolysis components or carbon capture components. And there's also a procurement focus on having the US government procure relatively clean materials for infrastructure spending. Most of these are technology neutral, so most of these programs don't specifically go towards hydrogen or CCS or alternate cement chemistry or any other pathway, but rather allow applicants for funding to offer whatever pathway for decarbonization they want and be scored on the merits of their proposal. But the final two, which I'll go into more detail on, are hydrogen specific. So one major piece of hydrogen specific funding that comes from the bipartisan infrastructure, or I'm sorry, that comes from the Inflation Reduction Act is the 45V Clean Hydrogen Tax Credit, which is a tax credit that's either available as a flat rate on an investment in a hydrogen production facility or as a per kilogram or per ton rate on hydrogen produced by a clean hydrogen production facility. And this table shows the different rates that are paid on the tax credit. So to get the most generous tax credit, you both need very clean hydrogen, near zero emissions or below 0.45 kilograms per kilogram. And you also need to follow some labor standards, which in this case would be prevailing wage and the use of apprentices on your construction project. And what you'll notice from this table is that that bottom right quadrant where you're following the labor standards and you're producing the cleanest possible hydrogen is much, much more generous than any other tax credit amount that a producer could get. So there's a strong incentive to get into that bottom right quadrant. This is all, this tax credit applies to clean hydrogen and it is tech neutral in its approach to that. So certainly you could get this tax credit by producing green hydrogen from electrolysis with renewable energy, but you could also potentially get it for blue hydrogen or pink hydrogen or other production pathways that have low or near zero emissions, provided you meet the emissions threshold. And there's currently a discussion around the exact implementation details of this provision and on how electricity for electrolysis would be sourced. And the current administration proposal from the Biden White House would be that in order to claim this maximum tax credit for near zero emissions, you would need to meet a 3 pillars threshold, which is similar to the framework that exists in Europe, where electricity would have to be newly added, physically deliverable to the project, and time matched to the production of hydrogen. But the details of that are still being worked out. The second hydrogen-specific piece of provision from this legislation comes from the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's the Hydrogen Hubs program, which is funding for geographically specific hubs to link together hydrogen producers, hydrogen end users, including heavy industry, and then transportation and storage networks. 7 of these have been selected, and BGA has followed this program very closely because of its labor standards, and we've been very impressed by the way this program has been administered and by the selectees with regard to labor and just transition provisions. So the funding opportunity announcement for this program requested a lot of information about community partnerships and labor standards to really incentivize applicants to go the extra mile there. And from the announcements and the details that have been made public so far, we've determined that 4 out of 7 of these hubs have active partnerships with labor unions. Now, obviously, we would prefer that number to be 7 out of 7, not 4 out of 7, but 4 out of 7 is a better ratio than a lot of other programs that have publicized selectees so far. So we are optimistic about the way that this program is being administered. So that's an overview of the legislation and where things stand right now, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Right now, money is being spent and awards are being announced, but we are working to make sure the money keeps flowing out the door. The projects actually get built and actually operate. We want to ensure that money is going to union facilities and disadvantaged and deindustrialized communities to ensure that these have strong economic benefits and facilitate a just transition and a diverse workforce. We want to see strong implementations of these labor standards, that the agreements and promises that applicants have made so far actually are adhered to and enforced. And we want to make sure that there is meaningful CO2 and pollution reduction, that this actually all works and achieves its ultimate goal. The long-term goal here is for a net zero industry in the US that is stronger and more heavily unionized than it is today, but we of course have a lot of work to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. I mean, you've made very clear how central really the kind of just transition part of this is in the US context. The importance also of trade unions and union jobs within the Biden approach, which of course also has an important political dimension. I mean, developing the kinds of jobs that you've been referring to is very important for actually garnering the kind of political support that maybe hasn't been in place to the degree necessary in the US in the past, and for retaining that. So I think it's important to stress that connection to actually being able to get this done in the first place is to really create these jobs. One small question I would like to ask before we get to our next speaker is, you refer to these different types of communities, and it wasn't entirely clear to me, the disadvantaged, the deindustrialized, and the energy communities. It wasn't entirely clear to me, is that a formal kind of categorization that's used in the legislation, that's applied in the legislation, or is something that the Blue-Green Alliance is sort of showcasing?
It's both. The energy communities and disadvantaged communities, which are purple and green respectively on this map, are formal. I think energy communities is written into the legislation, and disadvantaged is something that's come out of the Biden administration that's being formally applied to funding allocations. The deindustrialized communities definition, which is sort of the salmon on this map, is something that the Blue-Green Alliance came up with because we saw that there were certain communities that we felt deserved attention that weren't covered by the other two definitions, although there's certainly overlap between the three of them. And so we have made the case to the US Department of Energy that this should be something they should be considering as well. Since it's obviously not in statute, it can't be formal part of their evaluation, but when they are looking at grant applications or weighing applications against each other, deindustrialization is something that we're trying to persuade them to take into consideration as well.
And maybe we'll just take this one question from the chat, and then we'll move on. But so yeah, I mean, Laima was speaking about the renewables pull hypothesis very much in terms of sort of a country shifts from one country to another, because he was taking a global approach. But of course, in the US, we might also see some renewable pull happening within the US, like from one region to another. Can you comment on that? Is that something we're seeing already?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with the clean hydrogen economy, it's nascent, so it's hard to tell. But with more established green economies or green industries like solar and wind, as opposed to, and also including traditional industries like steel and cement manufacturing, there is definitely a pull from the traditionally industrial parts of the country, which are in this sort of the Midwest, which is the area in the kind of northeastern quarter of the US near the Great Lakes. That's where a lot of manufacturing happened over the course of the 20th century, early 20th century, and even before. And there's a lot more manufacturing now moving into the south of the country. There are different reasons for that. I mean, first, for one thing, for solar energy and other renewables, there's just where the sun shines and the wind blows. But one big cause of that is that the labor laws are much stronger generally speaking, in the northern United States than in the southern United States. So manufacturers can essentially get away with treating their workers worse and paying them less by relocating to a southern state, and in particular a state that's had a lot of Republican governance over the past few decades. So this is a concern for us. I mean, there's a mixed bag. It's a bit of a mixed bag because some of these states do actually have a lot of disadvantaged communities in them, and we want to see good jobs available for those communities, but we're also concerned that the jobs created in these states are not going to be very good. So there's definitely an emphasis for us on making sure that the traditional manufacturing communities in the northern US and around the Great Lakes and the Midwest aren't just completely hollowed out, and that they can retain some of their and maybe even rebuild some of their competitiveness through green investment in industry. We've been focusing in particular on really large steel mills in the Midwest as being potential candidates to transform into hydrogen-based primary steel production while keeping the production on the same sites that currently make the steel using the blast basic oxygen furnace route. But we also want to see just stronger labor laws across the country so that if production is happening in other places, there can't be this race to the bottom to treat the workers badly.
Well, thank you, Joe. So yeah, I mean, the US in some ways is a kind of a microcosm of some of the global questions that Laima has raised, and it's interesting to see how they play out. And so now I'd like to move on to our next speaker in another country that in some ways is a microcosm for some of these things. It's got a lot of different layers of the just transition debate that are sort of taking shape in South Africa. I'd like to introduce Mahandrea Rooplall. He, like I said, he's from the Industrial Development Corporation. He specializes on green hydrogen there. And he's also responsible for running the Secretariat of the Green Hydrogen Panel of South Africa, which was constituted by the Ministry of, I think, Industrial Development and Trade. Not sure exactly the acronym, DTIC. And he's also a lot of experience already with large infrastructure projects, dealt with that in former roles as well. So excited to have you here, Mahandrea. Thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raina. Good afternoon to everyone. Can you hear me clearly? And is the presentation in PowerPoint mode?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good to go. Yes, thank you very much. I think a bit of a different perspective from me. We are one of those countries which does have good resources in terms of the renewable wind and solar. And so we've also got a bit of history in the country. So it's not a new thing for us, which I'll show you for now. We've done a lot of R&D work, and we moved into the commercialization phase. And that's how it now comes that we have developed this commercialization strategy recently. So, as you mentioned, I work at the Industrial Development Corporation. So just briefly who we are, we're a development finance institution. We are owned by the South African government, which is our sole shareholder, but totally self-sufficient financially. And one of the things amongst the other things that we do is to proactively identify those new industries that looks to grow existing sectors. And one of those new industries that we're looking at, for example, is this green hydrogen industry. So I mentioned a bit of history in the country in this space. So as far back as 2007, we put in a lot of R&D money, and that was specifically by our Department of Science and Innovation into this hydrogen and fuel cell technology strategy. And over the next 10 years or so, there was a number of demonstration projects, as you can see there, along the value chain, bringing us closer to 2021, 2022, when a lot of the market demand, real market demand globally started happening with regards to green hydrogen. So, from our perspective, there was a lot of support given from the different bodies of government, like the presidency. At COP26, we also mobilized some funding. And then more recently, as I mentioned, is this commercialization strategy we developed, where our minister in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition requested us to put in a commercialization action plan to take the country forward. And that's basically what I mentioned here. And this was approved at our cabinet in October last year. But I think also tied to this, which I don't show here, after the October approval of this commercialization strategy, we followed that with a just energy transition implementation plan. So we go back to 2022 at COP27, where we released what we call the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And to be more specific, this year we took the investment plan and made it into the implementation plan. So if you look at the document, it's publicly available. Among the 5 or 6 sections there, green hydrogen is one of those prominent sections. And I'll tell you a bit more why. And so this is a problem statement we're trying to address. I think the previous speaker, Joe, did speak about deindustrialization. So we're experiencing that from a country perspective. And it's basically the contribution, manufacturing contribution to GDP that has been low and declining. So that's one thing. Secondly, we want to address decarbonization. But we need to do both of those within what we know is called the Just Energy Transition Pathway. And for that, I'm just referencing the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan, which I will discuss a bit more later. So our solution to how we address that problem, IDC has come up with what we call the Sustainable Industrialization Pathways for South Africa, which is a paper that we released at COP28. And these are the 4 pathways. Amongst them is this one that's applicable to green hydrogen, which is catalyzing low carbon and green growth. And that's how it fits into these 4 pathways. So let's look at the challenges. So, before going into discussing what the strategy looks like, there are 8 specific challenges we're trying to address from a country perspective. We all know there's a green premium, right? So green hydrogen is produced at a higher cost compared to gray hydrogen. So that's not news to anyone. How do we plan to address it? I think we want, as a country, because of our renewable energy resources, we want as a country to be able to utilize pricing subsidies to support export projects as a start. Secondly, there's a big awareness issue, lack of understanding of the benefits and applications of green hydrogen. And as we developed this commercialization strategy, we had to go to various bodies. NEDLAC is one of those bodies that comprises, the 3 bodies, namely labor, government, and the private sector. The PCC is a Presidential Climate Commission, etc. So there was an awareness campaign we had to go to explain to stakeholders what this green hydrogen is about. It's always thought of something that's used to produce electricity, or it's something that's going to take away a lot of electricity. And so we had to, explain the fact that it's more than just that. We'll show you later, in terms of the value chain. Energy security for us is a big issue in the country because we do have a deficit of supply of electricity. And as I mentioned, some of the concerns that came out from the public when we presented the commercialization strategy was, why should green hydrogen take away energy from the grid, which we're not planning to do? So we had to explain how actually green hydrogen can actually contribute towards feeding into the grid rather than taking away from the grid. Policy alignment is something we had to also get right. The green hydrogen commercialization strategy and the JET IP, both important policy documents. But what we did was we allowed the green hydrogen commercialization strategy to feed directly into the JET IP, ensuring there's alignment on the action plans. Infrastructure coordination. So here we're looking at things like your transmission infrastructure, obviously, which you need for your renewable energy to connect up, but things like also potentially hydrogen pipelines in the long term, and also things like ports, because if we do need to export, we need our ports ready. So all of that coordination now is happening from a national level, where we're coordinating the planning around all of these. Funding is obvious, I think, but the issue here is, we do believe we have potential to reach about 7 to 8 million tons per annum by 2050. It might seem like a small number, but if you run the numbers for that, the capex required for such projects are massive. And so funding, it has 2 components to it. One, you have to firstly crowd in because of the quantum, but secondly, it's about deciding what specific instruments you need to debottleneck projects, right? So, for example, you need grants. Grants can you apply during project development? When do you need concessional debt? How do you get that in place, etc.? So that's the second component. It's a quantum, firstly, and the type of funding we need to apply to debottleneck. Transportation costs, we know that is always a critical thing, that we say that transporting green hydrogen in its raw form is costly, but we know we're not doing that. We're targeting rather things like ammonia, conversion and transportation, and finally water requirements. So there's always this myth that because you're using green hydrogen, you're using a lot of water. Because you're using water to produce green hydrogen, using a lot. But if you run the numbers, it's actually relatively less. So it's one of those awareness campaign things that we had to sell to the public. The other issues around water, and I think someone mentioned desalination earlier, is that we would be targeting desalination because of the coastal facility projects. The reason we want to do projects at the coast is to export. So we have done studies by research institutions, namely the CSIR, that have actually quantified what the percentage of the cost of green hydrogen is made up by the water. And it's about, I think, less than 1%. So we actually said, let's take and make that into an opportunity. If you got the water just contributing 1% to the hydrogen, you can upscale it 3 times, having a minimal impact on the cost. But at the same time, now you have an oversized desalination facility that you can use to actually supply water to communities. So once again, spinning that whole thing like the energy thing, rather than taking away, you're actually giving back from a hydrogen perspective. So 8 challenges we had to address, and all of that we went and put into drafted the commercialization strategy, which is shown here, the 6 key elements. I already spoke about why we need to target exports. So we've got projects being developed where we want to, there is a real export market. It is the EU, it is UK, but also the East, Japan, South Korea. And because of our resources, we will be able to produce and export there. But we also recognize that there's a domestic market, a local domestic market, and very niche applications, some low-hanging fruit opportunities. Let me give you some examples. Someone mentioned green steel. So we have ArcelorMittal facility at somewhere near the coast, which is very applicable to using green hydrogen to decarbonize. It's a facility that we're going to restart. The other low-hanging fruit, we realize that we're importing fertilizer at a very high cost. At such a high cost, it'll actually be cheaper to produce it green, surprisingly. So we want to look at some of those low-hanging fruit opportunities in the domestic market. There are others that we'll also look at, like we do have the petrochemical base that allows us to produce sustainable aviation fuel, for example. Right now, one of the projects that's doing that is already applied to H2 Global, and they've been pre-qualified already. We want to support localization and the industrial base, and the reason for that is because we already got IP. I did mention a lot of R&D work went into that. We actually have 3 facilities being developed or already developed and running. One in the KwaZulu-Natal province is a factory that's already building fuel cell components, another that was built inland, and a third facility that IDC is funding for fuel cell components. So this is real. Now, the next thing we need to actually target is electrolyzer manufacturing. But localization of equipment also includes the upstream stuff like your renewable energy components that feed into this. I think that's what the first speaker spoke about, is that that renewable energy pool that this can bring. I spoke about financing. I'm not going to repeat that, but it's obvious that's a key element to the strategy. Then comes the 5th element, which is what brings that whole just transition part in. From our perspective, we have a history of in the country of inequality that we need to address. So we want to proactively maximize, the development of previously disadvantaged communities and individuals, and maximize job creation, and in our case, alternative jobs for job losses in the coal sector. Right. So amongst other things, we need to look at spatially where these projects need to go, because if you put these projects near the coal power station that's decommissioning, allows you to absorb jobs, but however, you need to do the skills and training that comes with that, right? Retraining. And then finally, at the bottom, the 6th element is the role of government in policy and regulatory support, which is fundamental, and that's why it's shown at the bottom as a foundation that it needs to form to create that conducive environment for investment, right? So that looks at what policy needs to be, supported from a government perspective, what regulatory changes we need to make, but it also includes things like when will government start giving incentives and to what extent, etc. Right. So those are 6 key elements. It's summarized. The opportunities we're looking at is, as I mentioned, market-driven, industrialization opportunities locally. We see the infrastructure build as an advantage or opportunity from the country perspective, and the decarbonization. What we've done is put it into a macroeconomic model to look at the impact on GDP and job creation. We think that's significant, a GDP increase and about 650,000 jobs to 1 million jobs by 2050. So moving on, I just want to touch on the value chain, very applicable to the South African context. So many of us may know what the hydrogen value chain is all about, but this is something that I've drafted just to show you what's applicable to us. So we know this part, I think, a lot. Let's start at the bottom. For us, we can target sustainable aviation fuel because we have the petrochemical base in the country. And as I mentioned, the project that we're developing now with Sasol and partners have already been pre-qualified for the H2 Global scheme. Now, staying with the petrochemical, you can also do e-methanol, which can go in as either an energy carrier or marine bunkering. Now, looking further up, green ammonia production, which we all know about. Green ammonia, interestingly, can also go into fertilizer production or export market. And finally, on the top, the green hydrogen itself. And the main application area would be for us in two key areas, one in green steel feedstock, and I mentioned the ArcelorMittal facility, and into vehicles. But as you see, we're targeting not light duty, mostly the long haul heavy duty, which I still think it's a bit of a challenge. On the vehicle side, we do see battery electric really competing right now and moving forward quicker. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to just move a bit faster now, Reina, but there are some progress recently that we've noticed over the past year that's good to mention. We, for example, we've signed a grant agreement with the KfW DFI to deploy 23 million euros of grant funds to some of these projects. IDC, together with partners, we're also developing a $1 billion fund, a private equity fund that will be concessional debt facility based. Yeah, and I think let me just skip through the rest. The last bullet is probably the most important, which is what I want to touch on before leaving, which is the projects that we have in the country. Just to bring this home to show you that, yeah, we're doing projects and it's real. So firstly, we've got projects that was listed in our government gazette. Once again, government showing strong policy support, but they're called SIP project, which is strategic integrated projects. And by law, what that means is that these projects will be given fast-checked approval for regulatory things like your environmental approvals, etc. So this was listed, and in addition to that, we had 11 other projects. Now, if you're going back, you can look at some of what we have. We've got the high shift to that aviation fuel project. Then we've got projects like this one that's doing green ammonia. This is a massive program that's developing a new port. And further down, we have more green ammonia projects. I think the one at number 8 is probably the flagship one in terms of size. That's a 3 gigawatt facility in the Eastern Cape. The Hydrogen Valley program is looking at mostly vehicles. Going further down, some of the interesting ones that you see here are the equipment manufacturing ones that I mentioned. Like the Project Phoenix, which IDC is supporting fuel cell manufacturing. Now that gives you just a bit of sense. I think I can quickly show you some pictures. The Hive Coca Green Ammonia project. Things have already started happening here. This is the 3 gigawatts one that I was talking about. This is the fuel cell manufacturing that is in development phase. It's actually in the feasibility phase that we're developing a 250 kilowatt solid oxide fuel cell equipment. Further, green steel production at the Saldanha Green Steel Production facility, and the sustainable aviation fuel. So going forward, this is the structure we set in the JET IP document. So I mentioned the green hydrogen commercialization strategy, but that fed directly into JET IP. JET IP now provides a structure of how we're going to take all of this forward. We at the IDC will play a central role with these work streams focusing on these different disciplines as you see here. I'm not going to go into the detail, but I think let's leave it there. The key messages we want to end with in summary is that we do have a unique value proposition because of the renewable energy resources, also proprietary fisher technology, and the PGMs, which I didn't touch on yet. The PGM minerals that goes into the equipment to manufacture. We do have both the export and local demand opportunity capability, so we can target both. We want to address the water and energy security issues rather than taking away from water and energy security, but giving back. Industrialization and local manufacturing forms a key component of the strategy to bring prices down in the long term. And obviously, it's about decarbonizing those hard-to-abate sectors. And so those are the key messages. And yeah, it's quite a comprehensive commercialization strategy, but very action plan focused. And we, moving forward with that in the country. I'll leave it at there. Thank you, Reina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mahandrea, for this very quick and comprehensive overview in sort of showcasing what South Africa is doing, has done to move this sector forward. And I think it's interesting that, and that's why I think South Africa is also an interesting case, because it is an emerging economy. It's needs to create jobs for its young population. It's got just like an history of inequality, as you said, so that's another challenge. And it has a decarbonization challenge as well as, you know, potential green hydrogen export opportunity there. So it's kind of everything there, and everything, lots of opportunities, but also lots of challenges. And I was wondering if you could maybe start by commenting on one thing, because you mentioned domestic offtake, but maybe maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my takeaway was that export is pretty important. It's a pretty important pillar of this green hydrogen commercialization strategy, and in a way maybe kind of to pave the way towards maybe more domestic uses at a larger scale at a later date. And that brings me to my question. So so basically, who takes the risks here, right? Because it's not entirely clear, you know, who will be using green hydrogen in the next years, for example, in the European Union, where the demand is going to be coming from. Will it be as big as anticipated, and will we ramp up as quickly as we would like to, and so on and so forth. So there's some risks if you invest, say, in green ammonia exports related to offtake. Will there actually be off-takers? So I was wondering sort of who's taking on those risks. Who are the off-takers that are signing off on this? Is the South African government absorbing some of the risks? Sort of what's the distribution of risks, and how do you see that from kind of a just transition perspective, you know, let's say between the EU or other potential importers and South Africa?
Yes, thanks. So you're right. Exports is a key component, and that's because it also tries to address the green premium in the interim as the prices drop. You know, so the prices are driven by renewable energy dropping prices and electrolyzer prices. And while we get that right, we want to export because there are pricing subsidy schemes. There's actually two now that we're targeting, which is the H2 Global in Europe, and there's a Japanese pricing subsidy scheme that we're targeting. So that big Hive project I mentioned that is planning now to export into Japan, and they are developing a pricing subsidy scheme. So that's key for us. That's the reason why we want to target exports, is to get some of that subsidy, and so some of that risk is being taken by the importers, and those importers are also bringing in development funds into the country. A good example will be KfW Bank from Germany, which has brought in 23 million euros. So Europe is one of those target areas. We also got in 50 million euros from the Dutch government, as grant funding that's coming in. So that goes into the projects to you know, get the business case slightly better. Additionally, the South African government as such is not taking risks because they've got other priorities, namely keeping the lights on, literally, right? So what you see that DFIs like us is actually who's coming on board and taking the risk. So we've got us and other DFIs in the country, in addition to, you know, the European DFIs and etc. But what we do is provide risk funding to develop projects, especially during the project development phase. When you need to do feasibility, you don't put in a debt facility there. So we put in risk-based equity facilities actually to de-risk, and so that we can make it bankable and get project financing. Yeah, thanks, Reina.
Okay, so basically, you're finding ways to do this without burdening, let's say, the government and the public in South Africa with excessive levels of risk and consequently debt. So maybe another question about the role of local communities, also the experience in South Africa with the Black empowerment kind of process. You know, how does that play into this? I mean, to what extent is that, you know, how is it integrated into this commercialization strategy? How is it starting to play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, you know, there's at least two levels at which that happens. One, firstly, many of these projects that I showed you is a very strict requirement from us. It's not a mandatory requirement, but a strict requirement from us, like DFIs and government, that there's strong partnership with local entities. So it may be a big, you know, maybe not mention names, or the big utility that's coming to the country from Europe that's developing a project, but there's always a requirement that there must be a local partnership, and that's happening proactively, you know, firstly, without even being mandated. That's one level. The second level is a community level. So we had a renewable energy program start around 2011, right? It's you know, quite successful, and it's still increasing in terms of the renewable energy into the grid. During that phase is where we set up community ownership structures, and specifically IDC funded those structures. So at the ownership level, we brought in a community consortium. We as a DFI funded that community, and there was, I'm not going to go into details because mostly I don't understand how the payback works, but there was an arrangement around how the returns came back to the community, etc. So those structures have been put in place previously. Those were in renewable IPP projects, right? And it's tried and tested. The intention going forward on these new projects is to follow something similar, where we can set up these community ownership structures at project level and get them funded. So that's the plan going forward. Yeah, Reina, hopefully that answers some of the question.
So there's a track record there that you're building on and that you can utilize to develop these projects. And you talked about water, and I think you also talked about sort of electricity. I mean, we all know, I mean, there are electricity shortages in South Africa, and then you mentioned that, so when we talk about green hydrogen, the question that comes up is like, don't we need those energy capacities to fill those gaps that we have in the electricity provision? But you said that this has also kind of been addressed, and that there's a way to make sure that green hydrogen actually is not a net sort of burden on the energy system, but actually contributes to it. Can you elaborate on that, and maybe then also on the water issue?
Yeah. I'll come back to the electricity. The electricity issue is a bit complicated. The water issue, so what we've shown, firstly, if you run the numbers, and that 7 to 10 million tons we're on target by 2050, if we run the numbers, the water required there comes out as less than 0.5% of the water we're using in the country. So you actually don't relatively need a lot of water. So that's a quantum, but the issue is more around where in the country you are and how you get the water, and about, using ability to be sustainable, use dirty water, and the coast you need desalination. So when it comes to desalination, the CSIR study I mentioned, and I must recall whether it's 0.1% or 1%, but the cost of so if your hydrogen is $1 a kg, and the cost of the water is around 1% of that, right? So what that report says, which I can get for you, is that why not use that to the advantage and upscale your desalination and use the excess to provide for communities. So that's how we want to take the challenge and flip it around. So let's move to electricity. Now, electricity thing is complicated. I think one of the issues we have here is not the fact that we don't have an issue with getting IPPs to produce renewable energy. The issue is at the grid, and where the grid is the biggest constraint. And where can you locate these projects so that you can still connect into the grid and feed into the grid? So what we've realized now, as we looked at these hydrogen projects and where they want to connect up, is that if you really look at the grid, the problem is when you do our energy planning, it's kind of the generation and the transmission are not actually talking to each other. So what we're working on now is actually having a whole system optimization for the country. So, but the problem that challenge of not having that integrated system means that there's bottlenecks in the grid that you can actually go and find and debottleneck. And so the project, the 3 gigawatt project that I mentioned, they have actually found places in the grid which they can connect. They can invest in infrastructure to connect into the grid, right? But that will allow other projects to connect. So let me explain what are these other projects. So we had, I mentioned the constraint being on the grid. So we had our government procurement program for renewable energy. Projects were presented and rejected. They were rejected on the basis that there's not enough capacity to connect. These projects have been developed and they're sitting there and they're waiting, right? Now, what this project, this Hive hydrogen project has realized, if you go find the right place to connect for the hydrogen project, and the hydrogen project would pay for the grid infrastructure, right? Okay. That will not only allow the hydrogen project to connect, but it'll allow another 15 gigawatts to come in of these projects that are already being developed. It's actually quite a strange scenario, but it's an opportunity that we want to take advantage of. So there's work going. I mean, it's a big story in the country because it talks about how we now unbundling whole of ESCOM into generation, distribution, and transmission. And part of that is when we get a new transmission entity, it'll allow new ownership structures for the grid, because presently ESCOM is the only entity that's owning the infrastructure on the grid. We want to move to a point where we will allow private sector to actually own infrastructure in the grid, which allow us to then fund grid infrastructure and debottleneck. So that's one of the key things. But the other thing is that the hydrogen projects are oversized and they will feedback also, and not just consume from the grid. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I would just also like to say to the audience that you're welcome to also raise questions. So if you do raise your hand, I'm happy to bring in people from the audience, not just through the chat, but also by way of asking a question here. But until we get up those hands, I would just like to turn it over to Joe and ask. So, I mean, you mentioned things moving south, and we also know that at least the Southwest is also water constrained. So to what extent is that posing an issue for green hydrogen industrial decarbonization processes in the States? Is something you're addressing in your alliance?
It's definitely an issue. It's not something that BGA, I think, has worked directly on yet. There's a lot of industry in the American Southwest, and the one that's being discussed right now is semiconductor manufacturing. There was, in addition to the two pieces of legislation that I mentioned, there was a third major piece of congressional legislation to incentivize domestic semiconductor manufacturing, the CHIPS Act. And my understanding is that manufacturing companies see the American Southwest as a really ideal location for new facilities in almost every way except for water availability, because while the climate there is obviously very harsh, it's sort of harsh in a predictable way. It's hot and dry every day. You don't have to worry about hurricanes or flooding or more extreme weather events that might be more common in other parts of the country. The water rights regime in states in the Southwest is super complicated. It's super antiquated. It comes from water rights were allocated during a period of anomalously high river flows on the Rio Grande. So there's more water rights allocated than there is actual water. And of course, the amount of water is going down. So this is definitely a big problem. The solution for industry is honestly not clear. I've heard people debate this topic, and I have not heard a solution that seems totally clear-cut and straightforward to me. There is definitely, you can do some water-intensive manufacturing in the Southwest. There's not no water, but you can't do water-intensive manufacturing and agriculture, which often happens there, and have large population centers, to say nothing of, golf courses and the like. So there's going to have to be some political compromise made. I will say, just on the hydrogen hubs program that's being stood up, which is sort of the first effort at regional coordination under the federal government, there is one hydrogen hub that's in California, in Southern California, and sort of goes into the desertified parts of the Southwest, but most of the hydrogen hubs are in parts of the states with more access to water resources, which I think will alleviate that constraint.
Okay, Joe, and then there's also here, there's a question to you actually in the chat, and it reads, "Thank you for these insights reflecting yesterday's discussion. I'd like to know if the communities have a right to consent and participation in the planning of these new industry projects." So question of engaging of communities. I mean, it's nice to know that they get extra support, but do they actually want this, and are they engaged?
Yeah, this is a point of discussion for BGA and for some of our partner organizations. I think a lot of the geographic framework was sort of written with the assumption that it's good to have a project in your community, but definitely not everyone is going to feel that way all the time. So I think a major piece of this for us that we see as really critical is the community benefits agreement provisions that exist on the Hydrogen Hubs program and a lot of other programs. And the way these are intended to work is that, before your project initiates construction or before it even secures the federal funding, you have to negotiate and commit to an agreement with a bunch of different community organizations and then potentially also workforce and labor organizations. So like an ideal version of that, as part of your application for funding, you would submit like, here's the project we're going to do, here's how we're going to use clean hydrogen to make steel or what have you. And then also, here are the labor unions who are going to work with the construction and the manufacturing workforce. And also, here are all these community groups that have signed on to our project that we're going to work with to, you know, recruit workers from disadvantaged schools with, or, you know, facilitate investments in community programs, or whatever the case may be. So that framework, the hope is that requires applicants for funding to go make their case to the community so that they can get that sign-on and that support from community groups. And then, you know, people will be glad to see the project move forward. Whether or not, you know, we have some concerns that in all cases that's not going to work well, and that these CBAs won't be well enforced. I think in some cases they're being referred to not as community benefits agreements that are negotiated, but rather community benefits plans that are kind of aspirational, and that distinction makes us a little bit nervous. So we're definitely pushing for stronger commitments out of those CBAs towards this end.
Thanks, Joe. Laima, maybe I'd like to turn it over to you, and because you showed a slide that was fairly general about sort of where different countries might end up in the sort of scheme that you had. Can you say a little bit more? I mean, maybe for the chemical industry side, for example, I mean, which regions or which countries do you see as kind of the winners there? And if you can, maybe where would you see South Africa, or maybe in steel or chemicals, following that sort of methodology that you used?
Yeah, so in general, I think, yeah, it's like we identified front runners for each of the applications, and in general, yeah, like we identified them for the steel sector and the chemical sector, but we differentiated in the chemical sector also between methanol and ammonia production, which might be difficult. Another thing to distinguish then, and yeah, as we already heard today, like yeah, those products can then be used to generate, for example, fertilizers or other chemical products. In general, yeah, we can talk about different countries, but I think like what was important for me to highlight here, or why I stayed at the rather general level, was actually to highlight that, yeah, there's a certain potential that we can assign countries, but a lot of the realization of this potential then depends also on strategic industrial policies that countries deploy on the ground, and some kind of challenges that, for example, some countries face might actually be overcome with the right policies in place. So I think especially in this emerging markets for hydrogen, those policies play a large role. And I feel like the framework that we have been presented for South Africa actually shows us that the country has quite some potential to enter about chemical and steel value chains based on green hydrogen production in certain ways. So I think there's concrete projects on the ground, and the political support behind it are actually also very important indicators that we did not map within our project, but that are yeah, also very, very important to consider.
And Mahandrea, one thing that we haven't talked about is sort of EU regulation, because I mean, we've stated that the EU will be one of the markets also that South Africa will be targeting, but all depends on, you know, whether the EU regulatory framework actually creates that market pull. And I know that this is an issue in the context of South Africa. For example, in the case of Sasol, with its sort of integrated chemical facility, and some of the regulatory issues, such as, you know, the way green hydrogen inputs into that system are accounted for, and how it can be credited towards then the products that emerge out of the system. Can you comment on that? Is that an issue?
Yes, it's definitely an issue. The project that we're developing is experiencing that, so that whole allocation issue. So yeah, exactly, for a facility like Sasol. So our indications, I mean, our principals have been having discussions with the EU delegates a few weeks ago on this. What we understand, it's a interpretation issue which they're willing to negotiate on. So it doesn't seem like the whole allocation issue is a hard and fast rule. We're hoping for that. That's one thing. But I think in parallel, we realize the whole RED II in the EU it can be a big challenge. In fact, we said it's actually a hindrance to the just energy transition. That's the comments we provided. And for that reason, we're also targeting the East market. We see a massive pull from Japan, and not just exporting to Japan, but also from the bunkering fuel perspective. So that's how we look at it. We need to be able to not put our eggs in one basket, and also look at the East market also. Yeah, thanks.
Can you comment a little bit more on the RED II? Why do you say it's a hindrance? Because
in terms of projects that are like the one project that we're developing, 350 megawatt. It's relatively small. It's totally off grid, and makes it easier to comply with the RED II from the electricity perspective. But if you're going bigger, the problem is you can't do a 3 gigawatt totally off grid project. And if you connect to our grid is mostly coal. So that's a problem, right? So electricity is one issue, but also sourcing of the carbon is another issue. Yeah. So RED II is a big challenge for us. We know that, and we're trying to work our way around that with different strategies.
So basically, you're referring to the additionality requirement mainly.
Additionality is the one that Sasol is struggling with right now on the aviation fuel project. Yeah.
And I
sorry,
believe
you're not talking about the renewable energy additionality, but you're talking about the allocation. Sorry, not confuse the two. Additionality and allocation.
I thought you referred to additionality now when you referred to the grid, but there's another issue with where you allocate the green hydrogen within the portfolio of products that you produce at one integrated plant, correct?
Yeah. Yes. Those two separate issues. You're right. Yeah.
And what's the status on that latter one? Because this one is not very well known. Maybe I should just lay out very quickly what the problem is. So if you have a very big integrated chemical plant, and you have a green hydrogen feedstock feeding into that plant, obviously not feeding the entire plant, but just a portion of that plant and portion of the production, then it is very difficult, or I would say impossible, then to distinguish where that green hydrogen was sort of ended up in the final products. It's basically spread out over many different products. But I guess the interest of Sasol would be to then sort of use the entire green hydrogen feedstock and allocate it towards its sustainable aviation fuels, and then sell those as green, even though in physical terms, they may include, let's say, fossil-based molecules in there. And now the question becomes, can they sell sustainable aviation fuels to the EU under the RED, or and this seems to be the how the RED regulates it is no, they cannot. They can actually only sell a fraction of that as sustainable aviation fuel, because only to the extent of the share that's going into the plant as a whole. So Mahandrea, the question is, so where is that standing, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, so it's standing with negotiations with the EU. So we've got our principals, our government, and the project developers having meetings recently with EU delegates on that. And we are told that it's actually an interpretation issue, and they're open to negotiate it. So that's what we're hopeful for. So they haven't said no. I haven't said yes either. I'm not sure what's the latest developments.
Okay, so that kind of raises issues that may be a bit different in the South African context than they are in the European context. Because in the European context, I think one way of looking at it, at least, is that breaking up this requirement really then favors the big producers, the big chemical producers in existence already in the EU, vis-a-vis the smaller ones that are very specialized on green products and that want to sort of have an advantage in that market. So there's a kind of a distributional tension, let's say, that plays out, or has implications that play out differently in different contexts. And I think it's an interesting case here how different just transition issues in different parts of the world then play out. My personal
like with CBAM, certain aspects of it is discriminatory, as we see.
CBAM it's another measure that's coming along, and
discrimination in the sense that it favors it doesn't apply the same standards to the European producers versus the producer like us who's exporting. So if you're saying there's elements of that in RED 2 too, probably, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have time to get into CBAM, but CBAM absolutely it has that kind of raises those kinds of questions as well, and is an important discussion to be had when it comes to these questions of decarbonization, but also justice in a local, but also in a global sense. And I think with that, I would like to just thank the three speakers, Laima, Joe, and Mahandrea. Thank you very much for bringing in these different perspectives on this question of just transition within the industrial decarbonization space. I think it was a very interesting sort of debate, and we were able to go through a number of the relevant issues. And with that, I would like to hand it over to my colleagues, my co-organizers, for moving us along to maybe the coffee break and then the next session. So thank you all for being here.